Welcome to Reformation Branches. In this course, we will focus on a contemporary response to Christian beliefs and practices that originated 500 years ago. Faithful and courageous reformers like Martin Luther branched off of the status quo of their day. To help guide us today, we are privileged to hear from Trinity's staff, pastors, and member pastors and others as we consider our own faith journey in the year 501 of the Reformation.
Hi, my name's Tim Korberg. I'm a member of Trinity and was asked to, give some ruminations on the notion of the priesthood of all believers and the idea of vocation. I retired from parish ministry at a relatively early age and then went on to law school and have been working as a lawyer for the last more than 20 years. But one of my life challenges, I think, has been the whole thing of my vocation. Kind of the question of why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing with the life that God gave me? And so these two questions about the priesthood of all believers and vocation kind of resonate with me in a pretty strong way. So I want to say something about them without saying everything. I want to talk about each of these ideas about the priesthood of all believers and the idea of a vocation as being a calling from God in a particular way. First of all, the priesthood of all believers, I understand that as being a sort of general calling that all Christians share. We are all called by God into a family that has certain characteristics. One of the characteristics that we as Christians have is this notion of being part of a priesthood. That's not the same thing as being a priest in the church or a pastor in the church. It's really much more than that. When we talk about the priesthood of all believers, that's the way I understand that as being part of a community that is called out of the world to be sent back into the world as agents of reconciliation, as people who are called to bring healing to a hurting world, to be ambassadors of Christ, or as Francis of Assisi says, to be instruments of God's peace. I find that to be a very high calling. It's a huge challenge. I think to be able to kind of step up in life as being one who exhibits the love of God in a world that is kind of contrary to that in many respects. It's just flat out difficult at times, but it is what we are called to. The notion of vocation is similar, except that I think when we talk about vocation, that really has to do with our particular vocations in the world, which has to do with how we show up, what we do in the world. Sometimes we talk about vocation as a job, like we have vocational training or we have vocational interest surveys, and really those have to do with some particular role in the world. But really I think this notion of vocation is much more than that. It really has to do with us showing up in the world as the people God made us to be. We're in the season of Epiphany. Epiphany is one of those words that, kind of an odd word, but I actually kind of like it. Epiphany means to manifest the essence of a thing. When we celebrate Epiphany in the liturgical year, we're really talking about God showing up, God's essence showing up through Jesus in the world. But I really like the notion of thinking about vocation as our epiphany, as our being manifest in the world, having our essence show up. And each of us has this thing. We were built in ways mysterious and magical that are very unique, and so we all have this makeup that wants to show up in the world somehow, some way. And I think our vocation, when we talk about our vocation, that really is God's way of calling us to this particular way of being in the world. Some people find that really easy. I've always been very jealous of people who just seem to know who they are and what that means. Frankly, I've rarely had that kind of confidence, which would explain in part my career track. I kind of sometimes feel like when it comes to our finding our vocation, it's a little bit like Dorothy and her gang in Oz. We kind of follow this yellow brick road, surrounded by lions, tigers, and bears, and at the end of that road, there's something we call home. But we think we've got to take this winding path, and we often do take that winding path. And yet, at the end of that path, as you might know in the story, when the Wizard of Oz bestows these particular gifts on the Tin Man and the Lion and the Scarecrow, the things that he gave them, they already have. So there's a song by the group America, one of my favorite lines, that Oz never did give nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have. And so I think, with our vocational life, our life of discovery, it's kind of like that. There's really nothing that wasn't already there, but sometimes it takes a while to find it. Other people, I think are more lucky. I was reading just today, I found an article about the Vikings quarterback, Case Keenum. And I'm usually reluctant to use sports analogies just because I think they get overdone sometimes, but I thought this was really interesting. In this interview, they were asking Case Keenum where his confidence came from, because he has a reputation of being just unflappable and extremely confident. And he's quoted as having said that his confidence comes from his faith. He said this: "God has equipped me with exactly what I need, so it's important I do the best I can with what He has given me." And I read that and I thought, well, see, there's a guy who's living out his vocation. It might not be his only vocation, but it clearly is a vocation. Well, I think if we understand both the priesthood of all believers and the whole idea of vocation as callings from God, that tells us something. It tells us, first of all, that they are holy because they are from God. And to the extent that we are able to faithfully live out those callings, that's what it means for us to live by faith. And it's not easy, but it is the abundant life that Christ promises us. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Matthew Garavaglia. I am a son of Trinity, born in Stillwater, baptized at Trinity in the early 90s, have been a member at Trinity my whole entire life. Recently committed to seminary at Luther Seminary. I'm in the MDiv program, but in the meantime, I'm here to answer a few questions about the Reformation, which I am absolutely honored to do. So let's dive right in. So in answering the question, what can we be as 21st century Christian Lutheran Church be passionate about as we look forward to the next 500 years perhaps, and even beyond that? And I think we can be excited about passing on our faith to the next generation, telling the story of the gospel and all its significance, passing on the truth of the gospel to the future generations, and really getting down to our roots as Lutherans and bringing a contemporary perspective of what that means to us now. 500 years ago, Martin Luther saw that some changes needed to be made. He had some objections to make. And I think at the heart of what Luther wanted to do is get to the truth of the gospel and get to a place where Christians could be focused on faith. And so as we move forward, we can really be excited and passionate about passing on our traditions, but also passing on those traditions in light of contemporary context. And diving into question 2, the Reformation dealt with the question, what can I do to be saved? So how should post-Reformation Christians answer the question, since I have been saved, what can I do? Luther was a monk, and he was hearing a lot of confessions. He was the guy that these monks went to for confession. And I think what Luther discovered is the sense of shame and guilt and just inner torment that these men were going through concerning their sins. They had no way to really get away from sin, and no matter how much they did, they still felt guilty about their sins, as if they had to be better or make up for those things. So once Martin Luther came up with these doctrines of justification by faith alone, such as we went through this whole preaching series in the fall, one of his major things was justification by faith alone. That we're not saved based upon works of the law or our obedience to the law, but we are justified through faith. And so that's saving work of Jesus Christ is for all. And so since we've been saved through faith, what can we do now? Well, Christ saves us so that we can be transformed and be present for our neighbors. So that means we can do good works that don't necessarily have an impact at all for our salvation, yet God has commanded us to love and serve our neighbor, and that really opens us to do that, because we're no longer worried about, well, I have to do these things in order to be saved. And in being freed from having to earn our salvation, we're actually freed to be of service to our neighbor, be fully present to our neighbor, serving them not out of obligation, but out of faith, hope, and love. 3 of those themes that we see in all of Paul's letters, some of the letters that Martin Luther developed his theology from. So what can I do? Well, what can I do, since now that I don't have to worry about being saved? I think faith nourishment. I'm in the candidacy process right now, which is something that you go through when you're in the process of ordination. And one of their emphasis is on all these things that help us nourish our faith. So getting variety in there, whether it's Bible study, prayer, meeting with men's groups, going to church on Sunday for worship, all of these things that help nourish our faith. Now we can focus on those things. So yeah, kind of combining questions 1 and 2 together, the interesting and fun thing that we can be excited about moving forward is passing on our faith to our children and telling the gospel with all its significance. You know, over the last 500 years since the Reformation, what has been lost, not necessarily is we've done a really good job of telling that gospel message, but what we can do moving forward is to continue to tell it with its significance. In a contemporary American culture, a lot of the emphasis is on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you just try your hardest, you can do it by yourself, and you don't need to rely on anything else. When in need, when in reality, our everything that we need is given to us by God, and we are utterly dependent on God. And so if we can get back to that and what that means in light of the gospel, I think we'll be in really good shape. So telling the gospel with its in light of its significance for us, for our lives, for our freedom in Christ. That's one of those Lutheran theological discoveries. He wrote this piece called "The Freedom of a Christian," and what Luther really meant by that is we're freed from the law, which used to bind us in some ways to God's faithfulness, but no longer is God's faithfulness in our lives dependent on our faithfulness to God. And I think that's just a wonderful message, that God continues to restore that relationship and make it right, despite the fact that we don't necessarily deserve it or we can't fulfill those commandments. And so that's what we have to look forward to moving forward. So thank you.
Good morning. I'm Bob Kriesel, a retired pastor, and thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this Reformation Roots class. And thank you also for the thoughtful questions that you gave us to work on. As we begin the 501st year of the Reformation, it seems that several of your questions had to do with how we are to live our lives as Lutherans in the 21st century. How shall we honor the heritage and legacy of Luther in our current times? Or to put it in one of your questions, since I have been saved, what can I do? In order to answer this, let's briefly review Luther's contribution to our understanding of Christian faith. Luther's theology was no less than a Copernican revolution to our understanding of the Christian faith. And just as Copernicus forced people to think of the sun as the center of the universe, with the earth revolving around it, instead of the earth being the center of the universe and the sun and the moon and the stars revolving around it, so Luther's theology turned religious faith from anthropocentric to theocentric. When Luther entered the monastery, his relationship with God depended entirely upon God, upon himself. It was anthropocentric or egocentric. His relationship with God was established by legalism or moralism and centered on following the rules, with hours and days filled with penance and flagellations and literally beating himself up trying to find a righteous God. But through his tower experience, his life was no longer centered on what he needed to do, anthropocentric, but on what God had already done, theocentric. So God became the sovereign and Lord of his existence. He came to realize that there was nothing that he could do to ensure his relationship with God. God's unmerited grace became the compelling focus of his life. And it is the righteousness of God, not human righteousness, which is decisive. One of your questions had to do with the priesthood of all believers, which means that we are all priests and live out this priesthood in our everyday vocation, in whatever we are called to do. Every vocation that contributes to the good of the world is lived out as faith active in love for the sake of the world. And the principle is that our lives rest on God's love, which is lived out in faith toward God and love toward our neighbor. In whatever you do and wherever we are, to quote Luther, where God has placed you, there should you serve him. If you are a student, mind your studies. If you are a maid, sweep the house. If you are a servant, care for the horses. A monk may live a harder life, wear poorer clothes, but he'll never be truly able to say that he serves God in this manner. But they who serve society, the state, and the church can say it. In the sight of God, it does not matter whether you are a man or a woman, an emperor or a servant, a mayor or a watchman, but this he asks of us, that we be obedient to him even unto death, no matter what our calling or position in life may be. Or as Bonhoeffer put it, as he sat in his prison cell during the Nazi era in Germany before he was executed, when God calls a person, he bids him come and die. And then finally, just a word about Luther's horrible comments about Jews and Mormons. Muslims, I'm sorry. This is certainly one of the saddest chapters of the Reformation history. We need to remember that Luther was a product of his times. In 1348, Germans, Jews, were massacred in Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and Augsburg. Spain, France, and England all refused to tolerate Jewish settlements. The Spanish Inquisition of 1492 expelled 250,000 Jews. Many ended up in a large ghetto in Venice. In his early years, Luther was more tolerant of Jews, and many Jews regarded him as a friend, and his hope was that they would be converted to Christianity. But in later years, as his health was failing and he was enduring all of the enemies that were fighting against him, he became more irascible. He believed the end of the world was near and that the Jews were the embodiment of Satan's work at the end of time. And so, as he was plagued by gallstones, kidney stones, depression, severe headaches, angina, and so on, it seems that he was no longer able to make the distinction between fact and fiction. Now, this is no excuse, mind you, but perhaps his outbursts against the Jews should be dismissed as the product of a sick mind. Unfortunately, Hitler used his words as justification for his final solution. And as for the Muslims, he had regarded the Pope and the Turks, or Muslims, as the Antichrist, the presence of evil in our world. They had conquered Constantinople and had advanced to Vienna, the very gateway to Europe, and all of Europe was quaking for fear of the Muslim horde. So, what should be our attitude toward other world religions? I like to think of it that we should picture God's love as a giant umbrella, and that God has invited all people to join us under this shelter. Then we don't have to prove anyone wrong or argue against them, but just be as welcoming as God has welcomed us and share what God has done for us and that this works for us, and welcome others as warmly as God has welcomed us.
Hi, I'm Rich Melheim. I was a pastor here at Trinity once back in the last millennium, and for the last 25 years have been working on Christian education, healthy family systems, and in this last year especially, we did a lot of work with Luther and the Reformation celebrating the 500th and thinking ahead to the next 500 years of what it means to be an evangelical in the best sense of the word, the good news word, and maybe somebody with a Lutheran background as well. Some people say the medieval era ended and the modern world began with 3 words: here I stand. Between 1517 and 1521, Luther, who really wanted to start debate about what he considered unbiblical principles and practices of the church, especially the Roman Curia, the immoral or amoral lives of the priesthood, the ignorance of the average Christian in Christendom. Starting just a debate, it turned into something significantly different. And one could argue with here I stand, for the first word, here, in the medieval world, you were not all that important. An individual voice, an individual conscience really didn't mean much. Unless you were very rich, unless you were royal, or unless you were at the top of the ecclesiastical world, there was no I. You didn't speak as I. The here was Rome, or it was whoever was the head of the Holy Roman Empire. And the stand, you didn't have a stand. You didn't deserve a stand unless you had money, unless you had power. You had no voice, you had no stand. And so here I stand was a pretty bold statement. That actually happened in April 16th, 1521. So we're going to have another pretty major 500th anniversary coming up here in a few more years. My mentor for my doctoral program, Len Sweet, said the next important phrase for the next 500 years is "there we go." It's not here, it's not a fixed spot, it's not just I, it's got to be we, because the problems that we will face as a church, as a world, as human beings for the next generation are not anything any one person can fix. And sticking in one place, here I stand, versus there we go, sticking in one place is going to be very difficult, because, unless it's in the Word of God, which we're going to stick to, at least I will, because the world is changing so fast, we're going to have to be on the road. On the road again, we're going to have to be on the road together. There we go. I have great hope for the future of the church, and the church is going to be a broadened movement, and much broader than the institution. I know so many young people, including my own kids, who see their primary Christian experience, their primary Christ-like giving to the world, their primary mission outside of the walls of the church itself. If there's one caution for the future, I would say we have to understand that the church is much broader than the church, that the body of Christ is much broader than those who sit inside the church on Sunday. The latest Pew research tells us that 60% of millennials don't see the institutional church as the primary place to exercise their Christian faith. Even though 70% will tell you they're Christian and only about 5 or 6% will actually claim to be atheist, most of them don't see the institutional church inside these walls as the place to exercise their Christian faith, which tells us something. It can't be here I stand, or in the case of the church, here I sit. It's going to have to be there we go. There, let's get out of the walls. We don't try to do it together. And you know what? It's a whole lot easier to ask a whole bunch of millennials to go and clean up a neighborhood or give away food and jackets. It's a whole lot easier to get them to do ministry and missions if they're physically, personally invested in it, involved in it with their own bodies. And then go. You know, 2/3 of the word God is go. I think for the next generation, we need to get out of the walls. We need to invite the people with good hearts and good minds. We need to name it, claim it, and reframe it as Christian mission, Christian outreach, and even calling it worship. The word worship is the Old English word for a vehicle that brings worth to God. I think we need to see our buildings as launch pads, launch posts, maybe as hospitals. Luther called the church a hospital. Hopefully we're getting a little better all the time. But if 90% of the mission is outside our walls, what are we doing spending 90% of our time in the walls? It needs to be there we go. And I think that would be a pretty attractive thing. Doing the mission of Christ, doing the work of Christ, being the hands of Christ, being the hugs of Christ, being the love of Christ, being the feeding of Christ, being the freedom of Christ for the 21st and the 22nd century. Not in these walls, but out of these walls. And I think Luther might even be happy with that.
Hi, I'm Pastor Deb Ost, and I'm one of the pastors at Trinity Lutheran. My area is care ministry, but I'm very thankful that I have been invited to participate in sharing some of my thoughts about where we're headed with the Reformation after 500 years of constantly reforming, and the Reformation still continues to this day and will continue as long as there are people on the earth. So what I wanted to share some thoughts about was how I see the church, and not just the Lutheran Church, but the Protestant Church, the Christian Church, how we are probably and have to move forward differently. And I see great, incredible moves towards sharing with one another, learning from one another as far as other religions, other denominations. And the Lutheran Church, the ELCA, the St. Paul Area Synod, the Minneapolis Area Synod, taking real active roles in kind of banishing, at least diminishing some of those old fears that we have of other denominations and other religions, that somehow they will take away from us by their very existence. And I grew up in a conservative Lutheran rural community, and when I went through confirmation, we did a lot of memorizing, as students did, but a lot of what I learned had to do with how Lutherans were different especially from the Catholics, and different from other Protestant religions as well. And some of that's important, but if you come away from 2 or 3 years of education, and the differences are really what are those things that you carry with you into adulthood, that's not a good model for how we live out our lives as Christians. So what I'm seeing that is really changing in those 50 years is that we're focusing more, the Christian church, the Lutheran church is focusing more on our commonalities. So what are those things that we agree upon? What makes us Christian, and not necessarily a particular variety of Christian? Or how do we see ourselves as people of God in a pluralistic society, so that there isn't fear, and there certainly should not be hate between Christians and Jews, Christians and Muslims, Christians and whatever other religions are different from us. And looking at Martin Luther, he focused a lot on how Christians were different from Jews, and how they were different from Muslims. And he put a lot of energy, a lot of study, a lot of writing into how Christians should be strong and take the fight up against the encroaching Turks, as he referred to them, as they were referred to, the movement of the Ottoman kingdom, and that was a real threat to those Christians. And we still are seeing a lot of fear towards, especially right now, a fear towards Muslims, and that's why I am really pleased that the ELCA, and again the synods within Minnesota and throughout the country, are taking active steps to have real healthy conversations with other religions, with Muslims and Jews, sitting down at the table, reconciling our differences with the Catholic Church, so that we are constantly working towards how we are similar, how we are Christians as Catholics and other Protestants and Lutherans. And we saw in the late 90s, ELCA gradually, starting I think maybe 97, full communion fellowship with a number of other Protestant churches. Let's see here: Presbyterian USA, the Reformed Church, the UCC Church, then a couple years later the Episcopal Church, Moravian Church, and then in 2009 the United Methodist Church. And those are all really important steps that we have taken, and we continue to have some really healthy and beneficial conversations at the upper levels with the bishops, between President Eaton, she is our presiding bishop of the LCA, and the Council of Bishops, of Lutheran bishops, and then a number of Catholic bishops, so that we are constantly working towards reconciling and coming together, because we need to work together. We are a global society, and it is a world venture that we are on, moving into the future as far as how we care for the earth, how we care for one another and work for human rights and justice issues. And we can do that. We can do that much better when we do it together. And if we set aside our swords and our harsh words and our fear and our anxiety and our negative attitudes, work together respectfully, we can make a much bigger impact in the world. And that's where I see the future going, and I see it in the younger people, as in millennials. I have 3 millennial children, and for them, the worldwide church, the worldwide milieu that we are in, is just common vernacular for them, and traveling throughout the world, and we need to follow their lead as older persons, older Christians, follow their lead and to learn more about other cultures, other religions, and by so doing, we learn a lot about ourselves. And so if you sit down and have a conversation with a Muslim, you're going to learn a lot about Christianity, because they're going to ask you questions, and what better way to learn about our own selves, our own religion, our own history, than to share that history with someone else. So as we go into the world to be the hands and the feet of Christ, we can and we will do that with people of all varieties, of all religions, all colors, all backgrounds, and we don't need to fear that because they are different religion than us, that that's going to take away from us, that they're going to try to make us something that we're not. We can be bold, we can be honest, we can be authentic, and we can work side by side with people, whoever they are, for great, important, common causes. Thank you very much.
My name is Don Fultz. Been a pastor in the ELCA for 35 years, ordained in 1965, and then spent about 14 years over in Africa with our Iringa diocese. Relationships, relationships, relationships. That's how Pastor Chris started her preaching a Sunday or two ago. In early 2000, when Eunice and I attended our missionary orientation training in Santa Fe, New Mexico, these were the same words that Harold Hansen, director of the ELCA Global Missions, used to start that event. So, language and words are very important. Bishop Eaton, in the latest issue of the Living Lutheran, writes about a colleague who told this story. An unchurched friend of hers was visiting and noticed her Advent calendar. "What is Advent?" she asked. It was a simple question, but this colleague soon discovered that it wasn't that easy to explain Advent to someone who had never heard of it, but who also had no frame of reference for it. This colleague tried to explain the season of hope, longing and preparation about the coming of the Christ child, but she saw a puzzled look on the face of her unchurched friend. So she stopped trying to use her church language. Bishop Eaton says, "It's not that my colleague lacks an understanding of Advent or isn't herself a faithful person, nor is she deficient in her communication skills. She had come face to face with the reality that a growing segment of our population had come face to face with the reality that that portion of our population had little or no connection with the church or any other religious tradition. They don't speak our language. They literally don't know what we are talking about." So Bishop Eaton goes on to say that many of us who have spent our lives in the church live in a kind of bubble. We do speak the same language, It's church talk. We know what we mean. We understand key phrases and metaphors. We know what makes sense to us. But for those who have either no experience with the church or perhaps even a painful one, we speak an unintelligible language. So where do we start? Well, for one thing, it's essential that we become missionaries again, and to do so without diluting the gospel or simply pandering for popularity. It falls to those who live within the faith to speak genuinely in a language and understanding of clarity. Why is this so important? Why is it that relationships are so important? Bishop Lull, in her 2018 annual report to our Synod congregations, talks about her latest Christmas Eve experience. Over 400 people attended the first worship service of a new Mission Start congregation using Luther Seminary as a location. The Anuk Ethiopians of the greater metro area have fled their homeland and the Makani Jesus Lutheran Church because of tribal wars and life-threatening situations. They have chosen to begin a worshiping body, thus a new culture, a new language, added to the plethora of cultures and languages already present in our St. Paul area synod. I want to focus on these situations as a catalyst to have us think about our, and therefore the church's, use of language to help grow the kingdom of God in our place and extend the Reformation into the 501st year. And to use Luther's small catechism as only one aspect of that faith which should challenge us all. So think, if you would, for a moment of your own confirmation journey. I suspect that virtually all of us, or at least those whose life journey has been in the Lutheran Church, were asked to memorize Luther's small catechism, or at least a part of it. You may have done this. Maybe you didn't like it, or maybe you even hated it. You probably wanted to make sure your kids did not have to do the same thing. As a result, year after year after year, less and less of the small catechism was used, until in some instances, none of it was used. Luther's small catechism contains the 5 basic foundational components of our Lutheran Christian faith: the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, plus other key values in our faith. In my 35 years of parish ministry, I suspect I experienced at least 10 to 12 different confirmation programs, each of which diluted or eliminated Luther's small catechism, until the last 2, and particularly the last one, which was a program that came out of this congregation via faith incubators. This program uses small groups with lay adult leaders and relationship building as foundational sharing and learning and teaching. Perhaps Luther's small catechism needs to have a language revision, one that identifies more closely to the current generation wording without losing the fundamental meaning. Now, this is but one area where the church today seriously needs to look at language as the tool for educating uninformed church people, even non-church people, for the express purpose of confirming a bega qua bega, shoulder-to-shoulder, side-by-side journey that leads all people to a stronger daily walk with Jesus our Lord. This should be what our faith formation is all about. as we continue living the Reformation teachings. How? This is surely the question that begs our participation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Jolivet, a member of Trinity for the past 12 years and an ordained Lutheran pastor. A little bit about me. I did serve a parish for just a short while, 3.5 years, in Eagle Grove, Iowa, in case anyone knows where that is. But spent most of my time in Lutheran higher education in the administrative side as a fundraiser and as a leader of institutions. So you're getting a perspective from someone who has not been in a parish a lot, but a person who has studied Lutheran theology and continues to remain interested in what's happening in the world today related to the church. So I have been assigned today a particular question that I think is one of the most important questions that we have to face in the church today, and that is, in our current cultural and social environment, what do you see as effective evangelism that would attract young families and individuals to Lutheranism? So I'm just going to start by talking a little history here, because I think this question goes back to the time of the Reformation. They say a Reformation happens about every 500 years, and we're now at the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's Reformation, and so you wonder what might be the next Reformation. I think this is it. What was happening in Martin Luther's day that affected his theology, or how his theology affected his practice? And that was that the church and government were in lockstep. In fact, the church was the law in many ways. People couldn't read the Bible, so the church told them what it said. The church interpreted it in such a way that the church had total control over people's lives, including their money, indulgences, and so forth. And so when those two became so intertwined, Martin Luther saw that that wasn't how God intended the church to be. It wasn't to be this institution that governed people's lives. It was to set people free. And so he posted his theses, and his theology led him to say, we need to put this in the hands of the people and let the people interpret Scripture for themselves, let the people understand for themselves what it means to live a life as a Christian. I think that's what's happening now, 500 years later, as we look at this new Reformation, if you will, and that we have a generation coming up behind us, me being an older person now, who doesn't look at the church the way I do or the way I've been taught to. And that is, the church is a place where government, the law, and faith are combined into one to govern our lives. The law is very clear within the church today. You live a certain way. You go to church on Sunday. You give to the offering plate. Your life has certain morals to it. And this is a little political now, I'm sure, but our world today is defining it in terms of how the more conservative Christian churches, evangelical churches, have defined Christianity. That is turning off this younger generation, the millennial generation, and they don't want anything to do with that. And so they're rebelling against it and reforming from within, is how I put it. Because I still believe these are people of faith who want to express their faith in different ways. So I think the question around the Reformation is, what kinds of Lutheran tenets or theologies give us information regarding this next generation, and how can the church, and the Lutheran Church in particular, speak to that to enable this next generation of people to live out their faith in new ways? For Martin Luther, language mattered. So when you use terms like evangelism, that doesn't really resonate with this next generation, the millennial generation, because to them that means telling them what it means to believe. It means inviting them to be a part of your community and being one of you. And that is not necessarily what the next generation or two generations want. They want to live out their faith differently. And it's not necessarily through an organized church. It's not necessarily through buildings and programs and employees, staff, professionals. It's by making a difference in the world, by engaging the world in new ways that make a difference. And so while we talk about evangelism as a way to convert people, if you will, to Christianity, to bring them in to become a part of our church, our congregation, to perpetuate the congregation that we've grown to know and love, so that in future generations, our congregation, our church is still here. And then, unspoken but true is put money in the offering plate so that you can keep funding these buildings and programs and people. That won't fly in this new Reformation. Excuse me. Because that's wasted money in their minds many ways. So what does it mean to engage with this next generation in a way that passes our faith on to them in a way that they can live it out differently? And I think that's a key. So I think one of the questions we ask in all of this is what's going to happen to the church if our normal kinds of evangelism that bring people into the church and make them one of us and help pay the bills, what if that goes away? Well, I think the bottom line to that, and this is where Martin Luther would come in as well and saying it's not our church, it's God's church. And so the forms that we have developed for the church may actually change. Some of them may go away, and new ones may emerge. And I think that is the new Reformation. The forms of the church are changing. The forms of the church will continue to change as people of faith exercise their faith in new and different ways. So how do we, as the more established community, Lutheran community, relate to this next generation, and how do we empower that? Well, I think number one is we need to be accepting, not judging. These are people who are trying to live out their faith differently than we would, but how do we encourage them by accepting them and say, you go for it, you do it. Secondly, how do we engage them in conversation? We can learn from them, and they can learn from us, and maybe that's part of the whole evangelism piece, is learning from each other and growing in faith as a result. So how do we engage with critical questions that are open-ended, that allow both generations, all generations, to be in conversation about what does it mean to be the church today? What does it mean to live out our faith in the world today? And then I don't think we can expect the millennial generation or the generation that follows them to join us. Some may, and we love it when the families come with their children to our church and get involved in children's ministry and sing for us and learn the stories of Jesus. That warms the heart. And that will continue to happen. But in many ways, that young group from post-confirmation through, let's say, mid-30s, that may not be married, or if they are, may not have families, likely are not going to join us. So how do we encourage, engage, and recognize that they have an authentic way of living out their faith as well? So I guess that's what I have to say, and I hope this spurs some conversation as you talk about what it means to be in Reformation today.